The relentless sun beat down on the cracked earth of the Arizona territory. Dust devils danced in the distance, mocking the parched landscape. Silas rode his sturdy Mustang, Jericho, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of water or shade. He'd been tracking a stray herd for days, and the heat was beginning to wear on both man and beast. He was a man carved from the harsh land, his face weathered, his gaze direct and unwavering. He believed in self-reliance and the hard logic of the frontier. Natives were a fact of life, usually best avoided. Trouble always seemed to follow their encounters with settlers. As he crested a low ridge, he spotted something out of place. A figure lay sprawled near a cluster of withered sagebrush. Curiosity, a rare guest in Silas's pragmatic mind, urged him forward. As he drew closer, he saw it was a young Native American man. His breathing was shallow, his skin dry and cracked. He looked near death. Silas hesitated. Every instinct honed by years on the frontier screamed at him to ride on. Involvement meant potential conflict, delays, maybe even danger. But something in the youth's stillness, a vulnerability that transcended the animosity between their peoples, stayed his hand. Silas dismounted, the leather of his saddle creaking in the sudden silence. He approached cautiously, his hand never straying far from the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip. The young man didn't react. Silas knelt, his shadow offering a meager respite from the sun. He reached for his canteen, the water inside lukewarm but precious. Gently, he tilted the young man's head and trickled a few drops onto his parched lips. A faint flicker of response, a weak swallow. Silas continued, rationing the water carefully. He knew this could be a trap, but the desperation in the young man's condition seemed genuine. He poured a little more water onto a piece of cloth and dabbed it on the youth's forehead. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, a decision settled in Silas's mind. He couldn't just leave him to die. He'd seen enough death on this land. He would offer this stranger a chance. Subscribe now for the next chapter of this captivating Western tale. Hauling the weakened young man onto Jericho's back was a struggle. Silas walked alongside, leading the weary horse towards his small, isolated camp nestled in a shallow canyon a few miles back. The journey was slow and arduous, the silence broken only by the rhythmic hoofbeats and the occasional groan from his passenger. Silas kept a wary eye on their surroundings, the vast emptiness amplifying his vulnerability. He knew he was crossing an invisible line, venturing into territory fraught with unspoken rules and historical grievances. Back at his camp, a meager collection of a bedroll, a small fire pit, and a few cooking utensils, Silas carefully laid the young man down near the flickering firelight. The youth's breathing was still shallow, but a faint color had returned to his cheeks. Silas brewed some strong coffee, the bitter aroma filling the cool night air. He then found some dried jerky and softened it with a little water, trying to coax the young man to eat. It was a slow process, each small bite an effort. As the night deepened, the desert grew cold. Silas wrapped the young man in his spare blanket, the wool rough against his skin. He sat by the fire, his rifle resting across his lap, his gaze fixed on the shadows beyond the firelight. He didn't expect gratitude. He didn't expect understanding. He simply couldn't have lived with himself if he had left another human being to perish. His actions were driven by a basic sense of decency, a quiet rebellion against the harsh indifference of the frontier. Sleep evaded him. The weight of his decision, the potential repercussions, hung heavy in the air. He was a white man, a cowboy, aiding a Native American. In this land, such an act could be seen as betrayal by some, foolishness by others. But as he watched the rise and fall of the young man's chest, a fragile sense of purpose settled within him. He would see this through. Days turned into nights as Silas nursed the young Native American back to health. Slowly, the fever subsided, and a flicker of awareness returned to his eyes. Communication was difficult. The young man spoke a dialect Silas didn't understand, and Silas knew only a smattering of generic sign language common on the frontier. Gestures and simple drawings in the sand became their primary means of interaction. Silas learned the young man's name was Kai. He was lean and wiry, with sharp, intelligent eyes that now held a cautious curiosity. Silas continued his daily routines, mending fences, tending to Jericho, but his focus was often drawn to Kai. He shared his food, taught him a few basic English words, and showed him how to tend the small fire. Kai, in turn, observed Silas with quiet intensity, his initial suspicion gradually giving way to a hesitant trust. He began to help with small tasks around the camp, his movements still weak but gaining strength each day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Kai pointed towards the west and spoke a word Silas didn't recognize. But the longing in his voice was unmistakable. He was telling Silas in his own way that his home was that way. Silas understood. Kai was healing, and soon he would want to return to his people. A sense of unease settled in Silas's gut. Returning Kai meant potentially facing his tribe, explaining his presence, and risking misunderstanding or hostility. But he knew he couldn't keep Kai here indefinitely. He had saved his life, but Kai belonged with his own people. The question now was how to facilitate that return without bringing trouble down on either of them. One star-filled night, as Silas sat by the dwindling fire cleaning his rifle, he heard the soft crunch of footsteps outside his small camp. Jericho whinnied softly, a low rumble in his chest. Silas's hand instinctively tightened on his weapon. He rose slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, illuminated by the flickering firelight. It was an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes deep and piercing. He wore traditional Native American attire, and a feathered headdress adorned his long, graying hair. He carried no visible weapons. Silas recognized the authority in his bearing, the quiet strength that radiated from him. This was a leader, a man of respect. The old man stopped a few feet from the fire, his gaze meeting Silas's. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence thick with unspoken questions and historical weight. Then the old man spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble, the words in a language Silas didn't understand, but the tone was clear. He was asking about Kai. Silas gestured towards his small tent, then back at the old man, a silent invitation. The old man nodded slowly and approached the fire, his eyes never leaving Silas's. Silas gestured again, trying to convey that he had found Kai injured and had nursed him back to health. He pointed to himself, then to Kai's tent, then made a motion of offering water and food. The old man watched him intently, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke again, this time slower, deliberately, and Silas recognized a few fragmented words of the common trade language used in the territory. You help my son? It was a question laced with both suspicion and a glimmer of hope. Silas nodded firmly, placing a hand over his heart. I found him, near death. I gave him water, food. The old man's gaze softened slightly, a flicker of something akin to gratitude in their depths. This was the beginning of a conversation, a fragile bridge being built across a chasm of cultural divide. Don't miss the next chapter to see how this tense encounter unfolds. Subscribe for more. The old man, whom Silas soon understood was the tribe's shaman, walked with a quiet dignity as Silas led him to the small tent where Kai lay resting. The shaman knelt beside his son, his weathered hand gently touching Kai's forehead. He murmured a soft prayer in his native tongue, his eyes filled with a deep concern that transcended any language barrier. Kai stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked from his father to Silas, a mixture of confusion and relief on his face. Over the next few hours, communication remained a challenge, but with Kai now awake and able to translate a few words, the story of his rescue slowly unfolded. Kai had been separated from a hunting party during a sudden sandstorm and had collapsed from dehydration and exhaustion. His father listened intently, his gaze shifting between his son and Silas. There was still an air of caution, but the initial suspicion had lessened, replaced by a wary understanding. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with streaks of light, the shaman turned to Silas. This time he spoke more clearly in the trade language. "My name, Chaitan. I am healer of the people." He then gestured towards Silas. "You, white man, save my son's life." It was a statement, delivered with a quiet weight. Silas simply nodded. Words seemed inadequate in the face of the unspoken tensions and the unexpected connection forged in the harsh desert. Chaitan then indicated that they would stay for a while longer, allowing Kai to regain more strength before the journey back to their village. Silas agreed, the presence of the shaman a heavy but not unwelcome weight in his solitary camp. The following days settled into an uneasy truce in the secluded canyon. Silas continued his solitary routines, checking traps, tending to his horses, and mending worn leather. Across the small camp, Chaitan, with a quiet intensity, focused on Kai's recovery. He meticulously prepared infusions from desert herbs Silas didn't recognize and applied poultices to the boy's wounds. Silas, for his part, ensured they had enough clean water and shared his basic provisions of dried meat and hardtack. The language barrier was a constant, frustrating wall between them, but moments of shared silence, the exchange of a knowing glance or a small, helpful gesture began to chip away at it. Silas found himself observing Chaitan more closely than he would have thought possible. He saw the shaman's unwavering patience as he coaxed Kai to eat, the deep lines of concern etched around his eyes, and the almost reverent way he moved across the land, as if it whispered secrets only he could hear. It struck Silas that, despite their vastly different worlds, Chaitan was not so different from himself, a man defined by his role as a protector, a survivor navigating a harsh and unforgiving world, bound by an unspoken code to those he cared for. One sun-drenched afternoon, as Silas meticulously repaired a torn strap on his saddle, Chaitan approached him. He held out a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if caught mid-flight. Silas looked up, a question in his eyes. Chaitan then performed a series of gestures. He tapped his own chest, then pointed to the bird, then to Kai, who was resting near the meager fire, and finally made a sweeping motion of flying with his hand. Silas understood. It was a symbol of hope, a silent prayer for healing, a representation of Kai's spirit taking flight once more, freed from the grasp of illness. Silas accepted the gift, turning the smooth, cool wood over in his calloused hands. It was a simple token, yet it carried a profound weight of meaning that transcended any need for words, a silent acknowledgement of his aid. Later that same day, with Kai now visibly stronger, the boy sat with Silas by the crackling fire, the sunset painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple. Kai, his initial apprehension replaced by a burgeoning curiosity, pointed to Silas's ever-present rifle propped nearby and then mimed the action of shooting. Silas nodded, recognizing the unspoken question. Slowly, deliberately, he picked up the rifle and, in simple terms and with carefully demonstrated gestures, showed Kai how to handle the weapon safely, explaining its basic workings. Kai watched with keen interest, his eyes absorbing every detail. It was a peculiar moment of shared knowledge, a small but significant step towards understanding each other's disparate worlds. In that quiet exchange, Silas realized that beneath the surface of their differences, a common humanity pulsed, a shared respect for survival, for resilience, and for the primal need to protect. The air in Silas's secluded camp was thick with an impending change. The time for Kai and Chaitan to depart was drawing near. Kai, no longer needing assistance, now moved with a newfound energy, his strength visibly returning with each passing day. A sense of temporary companionship, a brief but profound interlude in Silas's solitary existence, hung heavy, soon to dissolve back into the familiar silence of the desert. On their final morning, as the sun began its slow ascent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the canyon floor, Chaitan stood before Silas. He extended his hand, a solemn gesture of peace and farewell. Silas met his gaze and clasped it firmly, the rough, calloused skin of their hands a silent testament to the harsh lives they both endured. Chaitan then spoke, his voice grave, the words carefully chosen. "You helped my son. My people will not forget." He paused, his deep-set eyes searching Silas's face, conveying a depth of gratitude that reached beyond their linguistic divide. "But there are others, white men, who have brought only pain. Be wary." Silas nodded slowly, the unspoken warning clear. He understood the fragile nature of the peace they had found, a small, isolated island in a vast, turbulent sea of ongoing conflict. The threat was real, ever present, and he knew it. Then Kai stepped forward, a small, meticulously crafted leather pouch held carefully in his hand. He offered it to Silas. Silas, intrigued, opened the pouch to reveal a few smooth, polished stones, each one uniquely colored, reflecting the subtle hues of the desert. Kai gently touched his own heart, then pointed to the stones, and finally to Silas. It was a profound gesture of gratitude, a piece of his spirit, a tangible connection offered in return for Silas's kindness. A rare warmth spread through Silas, a feeling he hadn't known in years. He understood implicitly that these stones were more valuable than any gold or material possession. As Chaitan and Kai turned, their silhouettes gradually fading against the vast, desolate expanse of the desert, Silas watched them go. He knew, deep in his gut, that he would likely never see them again. The encounter had been a brief, unexpected interlude in his otherwise solitary life, a ripple in the calm surface of his existence. Yet, something had irrevocably shifted within him. He had acted not out of any expectation of reward or recognition, but from a simple, unadorned sense of human decency. And in return, he had received something far more valuable, a glimpse into another world, a moment of profound connection that transcended the deep, entrenched divides of the frontier. He was still Silas, the cowboy, a solitary figure navigating a harsh and often brutal land. But he was no longer quite the same man who had found a dying stranger in the dust. Stay tuned for the final chapters of this powerful story. Subscribe now to see the lasting impact of this unlikely encounter. Weeks bled into months, the seasons subtly shifting across the vast plains. Silas returned to the predictable rhythm of his solitary routines, riding the fence lines, tending his small herd, and keeping his worn cabin in order. The memory of Kai and Chaitan, however, remained a quiet, persistent echo in the profound silence of his days. He often found himself reaching into the small leather pouch, the smooth, polished stones, a tangible, comforting reminder of their brief, intense encounter. The intricately carved wooden bird, a silent testament to an unexpected connection, sat on a rough-hewn shelf in his cabin, a constant presence. He hadn't uttered a single word about what had transpired to anyone. It was a deeply personal experience, something he held close, tucked away in the quiet, guarded corners of his mind. One crisp autumn day, as he rode into the small, dusty trading post in the nearest town for supplies, Silas immediately sensed a shift in the atmosphere. A palpable tension hung heavy in the air, a low hum beneath the mundane sounds of commerce. Hushed whispers rippled through the townsfolk, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and barely suppressed anger. He soon learned the reason. There had been a marked increase in skirmishes between isolated settlers and local Native American tribes. Fear and raw resentment were simmering dangerously close to the surface of everyday life, threatening to boil over. Silas, ever the observer, kept his own counsel, listening intently but offering little. He understood the profound fear on both sides, recognizing the destructive cycle of violence fueled by generations of misunderstanding and shattered promises. As he was methodically loading his provisions onto Jericho, his trusty horse, Silas felt a familiar, unsettling gaze upon him. He turned slowly to see a small group of men he knew, hard-eyed ranchers whose faces were grim. These were men who held strong, unyielding opinions about the Indian problem, their rhetoric often laced with venom. Their leader, a burly, imposing man named Jed, stepped forward, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Silas," Jed drawled, his voice thick with unspoken accusation. "Heard you've been spending a lot of time out in the territory lately. Seen any signs?" Silas met his gaze directly, his own eyes unwavering. "Just minding my own business, Jed, like always." Jed's eyes narrowed further, his jaw tightening. "Some folks say you might be getting a little too friendly with them savages." Silas's hand instinctively went to the familiar cold steel of the Colt at his hip, but he resisted the ingrained urge to draw. "I helped a man in need," he stated, his voice low, steady, and devoid of emotion. That's all there was to it. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife, unspoken threats passing between them like silent lightning. Silas knew he had to be exceedingly careful. His simple act of compassion, a humane gesture in a brutal land, could easily be twisted into something dangerous, something that could put a target on his back. Silas returned to his remote ranch, the encounter at the trading post leaving a bitter, acrid taste in his mouth. The overt suspicion and thinly veiled hostility were a stark, painful reminder of the deep, seemingly unbridgeable chasm that separated the two worlds. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that his connection with Kai and Chaitin, however brief and unassuming, had placed him in a precarious, dangerous position. He was now neither fully accepted nor implicitly trusted by the white settlers, nor could he assume complete trust from the Native American tribes. He was a man caught squarely in the middle, his actions scrutinized, his motives viewed with profound suspicion by both sides. He spent the next few weeks in a heightened state of vigilance, his senses sharpened, attuned to every subtle sound, every shifting shadow, every potential sign of trouble. He methodically strengthened the meager defenses around his small, isolated cabin, reinforcing doors and checking his ammunition supply. Jericho, his horse, was kept closer than ever, always saddled and ready for a hasty departure if needed. He knew, with an unsettling certainty, that Jed and his cronies would be watching him, their mistrust a palpable weight. But he also couldn't discount the possibility of encountering other, less understanding Native American tribes who might view any white man, regardless of his intentions, with ingrained hostility. One evening, as the last vestiges of dusk bled across the vast, expansive sky, painting the horizon in muted purples and greys, Silas noticed a faint, flickering signal fire on a distant ridge. It was a pattern he recognized, one that Chaitin had subtly shown him during their time together. A specific sequence of flashes that indicated peace, a desire for communication, not aggression. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him, a turbulent tide of apprehension and an undeniable pull. Part of him yearned to ignore it, to remain isolated in his safe, known solitude, to avoid any further entanglement in a conflict that wasn't his. But another part, The fundamental core that had compelled him to offer water to a dying stranger, felt an undeniable magnetic pull towards that distant, flickering flame. He knew the risks were immense, perhaps even suicidal, but the enduring memory of Chaitan's quiet dignity and Kai's silent, profound gratitude stayed with him, a guiding light in the encroaching darkness. After a long, agonizing night of deliberation, weighing the profound dangers against an almost inexplicable sense of obligation, Silas made his decision. He would ride out. He had to know what the signal meant. He had to know if the fragile bridge he had helped to build could possibly withstand the harsh, unforgiving realities of the frontier. Under the cloak of profound darkness, broken only by the distant, unwavering beacon of the signal fire, Silas rode towards the distant ridge. His heart pounded a relentless rhythm against his ribs, a complex mixture of raw apprehension and a strange, almost spiritual sense of purpose. He moved with the innate caution of a seasoned frontiersman, his senses acutely alert to every rustle of dry brush, every whisper of the wind, every deepening shadow that might conceal a threat. As he finally approached the designated ridge, illuminated subtly by the flickering embers of a small, carefully tended fire, he saw a lone figure waiting for him, silhouetted against the vast, star-strewn canvas of the night sky. It was Chaitan. The old shaman greeted him with a simple, silent nod, his deep-set eyes conveying a profound, unspoken understanding that transcended words. Chaitan then spoke, his voice low and measured, explaining that the recent tensions were escalating rapidly, a wildfire fueled by generations of misunderstandings and escalating acts of violence on both sides. He had sent the signal fire, a desperate plea, hoping to find a way to prevent further, needless bloodshed. He believed that Silas, having shown such unexpected kindness to his son, might possess the unique capacity to be a voice of reason, a fragile bridge between their two perpetually warring worlds. Together, under the immense, silent expanse of the starlit sky, they spoke for hours. Chaitan, with a solemn dignity, shared the deeply ingrained grievances of his people, the broken treaties, the relentless encroachment on their sacred ancestral lands, the countless injustices they had endured. Silas, in turn, spoke of the palpable fear and gnawing uncertainty of the settlers, their relentless struggle to carve out a life in a harsh, unforgiving land, often with little understanding of the consequences of their expansion. It was a difficult, emotionally charged conversation, laden with the immense weight of history, the raw pain of past injustices, and the deep-seated mistrust that had festered for generations. As the first faint blush of dawn began to break on the horizon, painting the vast landscape with hues that simultaneously hinted at both hope and despair, Chaitan made a solemn plea. He asked Silas to speak to the settlers, to share his unique experience, to try and foster a glimmer of understanding and, perhaps, even empathy. He knew it was a desperate, almost impossible long shot, fraught with immense danger, but he believed with a quiet conviction that even a small spark of compassion, if properly fanned, could still make a profound difference. Silas looked out at the vast, untamed land, a land that held both breathtaking beauty and brutal, unforgiving savagery. He thought of Kai, of the intricately carved wooden bird, of the smooth, comforting stones in his leather pouch. He knew the risks were unimaginably great, that he might face scorn, ridicule, and outright rejection from his own people, perhaps even worse. But he also knew, with an unshakable certainty, that he could no longer stand idly by while more innocent lives were tragically lost. With a deep, resolute breath, Silas nodded. "I will try," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "I will speak what I know to be true." In Chaitan's eyes, a faint, glimmering spark of hope ignited. The path ahead would be undeniably difficult, fraught with immense challenges, entrenched resistance, and profound danger. But in the heart of the unforgiving American West, an unlikely alliance had been forged, a fragile seed of understanding planted in the barren ground of conflict. The compelling story of the cowboy and the shaman was far from over. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story of the Old West, please subscribe to our channel for more compelling narratives and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter.